mother. All of these generations, and I had photographs of them on both sides, my mom and my dad's mother and father's side, and it was like, how many grandmothers do you have? I'm like, think about it, you have one too, but you may not know who they are, you may not have any photographs of them.
Well, did they all come from generally the same area?
We are just all in the little town of Bogue, about 5 miles from here.
Oh, yeah. Is it, they tell me where that?
It's right off of Highway 24, just about 4 miles west of here.
They're out about 2/3 west of the state. And just a little southerly from where we are.
124.
I was surprised how far it was out there, but I heard Concordia.
Oh, you did?
And so, you know, I remember when they voted down, we traveled around.
welcome Angela Bates for her presentation, Children of the Promised Land. Our program is brought to us by the Kansas Humanities Council, a nonprofit organization that connects communities with history, traditions, and ideas to strengthen civic life. Now, so that we may all enjoy the program, please take a moment, perhaps even 2 moments, it's that important, to shut off your cell phone. Disconnect from the now so we can better engage in history. Angela Bates, a Nicodemus descendant and historian, is the executive director and founder of the Nicodemus Historical Society. Working with the Nicodemus community, the National Park Service, and Senators Dole and Roberts, she helped designate Nicodemus as a National Historic Site. Angela presents educational programs to cultural organizations across the nation, covering the history of Nicodemus, exodusters, and black towns in the West, Buffalo Soldiers, and black women in the West. Her series of children's books, Adventures of Nicodemus Annie, focus on the history of Nicodemus. She joined the KHC Speakers Bureau in 2010. So please welcome Angela Bates.
Steps. This is a little clicker.
Yes.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you for the invitation. I mean, I am excited always to tell the history of Nicodemus and various aspects of the history. Can you hear me? Or
Yeah.
do I need a mic? Or can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So it always gives me great pleasure to be able to talk about Nicodemus. I can talk about Nicodemus morning, noon, and night, and from sun up to sundown, really, because it's a part of my history, it's a part of my family history, and it is definitely my passion. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the history of Nicodemus, so you'll have a backdrop for the children of the Promised Land, and these were the first and second generation of children born free, born in Nicodemus, and reared in Nicodemus. I know I've talked to quite a few of you here already about different aspects of Nicodemus's history, but just to give you a synopsis of it, it's the only remaining all-black town and the oldest remaining all-black town west of the Mississippi. And that's what its historical significance, and that historical significance is what allowed it to be a part of the National Park Service. In order for a place to be designated as a unit of the National Park Service, it has to be unique. It has to be unique not only to an area or a region, it has to be significant nationally. It has to fit into the national historical context of American history. So Nicodemus represents that part of American history that relates to people settling in the West. I know we hear about the Native Americans and of course the white settlers, and we hear sometimes about the railroad and the Chinese workers, but very seldom do you hear about the black settlers. And just probably in the last 15, 20 years, we hear more about the Buffalo Soldiers being a part of the western frontier. But Nicodemus represents those all-black towns that dotted the western frontier. And like I said, it's the only and oldest remaining all-black town west of the Mississippi. And a lot of people that are familiar with Oklahoma, they'll say, well, what about Boley, Oklahoma? Well, Boley still is in existence, but it was established after the turn of the century. Nicodemus was established in 1877 by former slaves from Kentucky, primarily Kentucky, a few from Tennessee, and a few stragglers from Mississippi. But the bulk of them came from Kentucky. Well, how did they get to Nicodemus? I mean, they didn't just drop out of the sky in 1877. So in 1877, a man by the name of W.R. Hill, who was a town speculator, he was just like the real estate developers of today. You can go and claim, stake out a claim on 160 acres and build a town. And you could get it platted, and it was left up to you to go get people to settle there, and you could make money by selling town lots. Well, he had been responsible for people settling in parts of Hutchinson and Wichita, and when he ventured west as a land agent for Pomeroy, one of the railroad tycoons, he decided that he's going to build a town and name it after himself, which is Hill City. But while he was there scouting in the area, he decided, after he met one of the settlers who had already homesteaded out there by the name of Smith, he convinced him to go into partnership with him. Then they went to Topeka and met 4 ministers, African-American ministers, and they collaborated and created the Nicodemus Town Company. And then they said, now, okay, we've located the land on the north side of the Solomon River in northwest Kansas, in Graham County. Now, where are we going to get people to settle? So they decided to go back home, and home was Kentucky. And they went to the central bluegrass area. They went to Lexington and Georgetown. There's some people from Frankfort, but in that central bluegrass area is where the bulk of the people came from. And they came primarily because of the land. They were solicited to come and become homesteaders and also to populate the town of Nicodemus. And so that was a lot more appealing than to deal with the violence and the discrimination that they were dealing with in the post-Civil War time period with all the Jim Crow laws. So the push became all of the violence and the Jim Crow laws, and the pull became the land and to settle in Nicodemus. So in the spring of 1877, W.R. Hill and one of the ministers, Roundtree, went back to Kentucky and went to the churches, primarily because they could go to the churches and talk to large groups of blacks, because it was prohibited for African Americans to gather together in large groups. So they went to the church, and the churches is where they were allowed to gather in large groups. And they promoted the town. And they said, we'll be back in the spring. Not the spring, they'll be back in the fall to gather everybody up and help them to migrate out and then help them to get settled on the land. In the meantime, the Cincinnati Southern Railroad opened a spur from Cincinnati all the way through the bluegrass area, all the way down to Nashville. And that provided transportation from the central bluegrass area out north to Cincinnati, which was just about 80-some miles. And then that was the big hub for trains going east and west. They got on trains, took them all the way west to a town called Ellis, which is about 16 miles west of Hayes, and that was the terminus where they turned the trains around and went back. So then once they got to Ellis, they still had a 35-mile trek over uncharted land, so to speak, over to the town site of Nicodemus. And so about 350 people came that first year, and that was September 17th, 1877 was when they arrived on the town site. Some of the founding fathers had already moved out. They had applied for a post office, and it was one of the first post offices to be run by African Americans in the United States. The postmaster was Zach Fletcher. He was the son-in-law of the homesteader Smith. And so a few of them were already there when the people came, but many of them were discouraged at what they saw because of the lush land and water, plentiful water and what have you in Kentucky versus the dry high plains of Kansas with no trees to build anything with. They were a little dismayed. But the second group came several months later in the spring of 1878. And when they came, they were also from the central bluegrass area. About 60 of them turned around and went back. They just thought, oh no, this is a little bit much. And they went back to the town of Ellis. And so most of the population in, African-American population in Ellis are the descendants of those people that did not stay in Nicodemus but decided to go back to at least what they called civilization, which was Ellis. The third group came in 1879, a year later, and they were originally from the Kentucky area but had moved to the Missouri area right before the Civil War. And then after the Civil War and Emancipation came, they moved over from Weston, across the river to Leavenworth, and from there they ended up moving into Nicodemus in 1879. So that was the three large groups. There were smaller subsequent groups that came and individual families that came. Some came from Nebraska, some came from different other parts of the state. But in its heyday, which was the mid-1880s, about 1885, when they were trying to attract the railroad, there was close to 650, 700 people that actually occupied Nicodemus. There were some movers and shakers in the town. In 1878, they had the first census taken, and they forced the organization of the county, because the county, Nicodemus, is located right on the western border of Brooks County. So they forced the organization of Graham County, and all of the county officials were African American. The first clerk of the county, his name was Edward P. McCabe. He went on to become the state auditor for 2 terms, the first elected black in the state. He was a state auditor for 2 terms, and if you go to the Capitol there in Topeka and you look in the rotunda, there is a portrait of him, but he was the Nicodemus Town Company secretary. He and his partner, Abram Hall, were from the Chicago area, found out about Nicodemus. Well, really, they were coming not to Nicodemus necessarily, but they were coming to the western part of the state so they could assist people that were going to be migrating out. And they were really kind of on their way down to Hodgman County, because they heard that a settlement was going to establish there. But they got interrupted in Leavenworth and ended up coming with the group in 1879. In its heyday, like I said, there was about 650, 700 people that actually settled there. 3 railroad companies were looking at laying tracks through Nicodemus. None of them materialized. W.R. Hill happened to be a land agent for one of the railroads, the Missouri Pacific, and they were the ones that ended up laying track through the area, bypassed Nicodemus by about 4 miles. In the little town of Bogue, which is where I live, which is about 4 miles to the west and 1 mile south, right there on the river, became a town. It was a railroad community, and the railroad put money into it, organized it as a town, and named it after one of their engineers. And when that happened, it pulled the economic base out of Nicodemus. The white merchants that did live there, like the banker I was telling someone earlier, there was a white banker there by the name of McPherson. He disassembled his building, and that's what they did. You know, wood was very, very scarce, very, very expensive to be brought in, so they eventually started using limestone, the native limestone, to build buildings out of, and they would recycle buildings. They didn't get rid of wood, they didn't get rid of limestone, they would disassemble buildings and rebuild them wherever they were moving to. So a lot of the merchants that were in Nicodemus ended up moving over to the town of Bogue, and that's when Nicodemus lost its economic base, its footing, and then because of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl years, it, like many of the towns out west, started to, go into a downward spiral. So then after the Great Depression, people started really getting discouraged and moving away. And in the 1950s, my parents' generation moved. Many of them moved to Southern California, Northern California, and Colorado. I grew up in Pasadena, California. My parents left in the mid-50s. I should say the latter 50s. They left about 1956. So I guess I was about 4, almost 5 years old when they left. But every year since 1878, they have an emancipation celebration. It's one of the oldest and longest running, continuously running African American festivals in the state. This year we will be celebrating our 140th emancipation celebration. And so that becomes the catalyst for people to come back home and reconnect, not just with the geographic town of Nicodemus, but with one another as extended family members. So everybody was marrying each other, and it got down to my generation, and there's just a few families that are not related. So everybody is pretty much related, even if I have some cousins, I'll say they're cousins. They're not really related to me, but we share first cousins, and that sounds strange, but how can that be? It does. It can actually happen. So we have this tight-knit community of extended families, which makes it a unique situation. So when people come back, they're coming back for their reconnection with their families as well as their reconnection with the town of Nicodemus. In 1976, Nicodemus was designated a National Historic Landmark District. It was put on the Register of Historic Districts, and then 20 years later, in 1996, after 7 years of working with Congress and the National Park Service, we became a unit of the National Park Service. And the difference between the Landmark District and the National Historic Site is the Act of Congress that designates it, and the line item on the National Park Service budget that says Nicodemus, just on the list right along with Yosemite and those big natural parks, as well as monuments and sites like the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, Frederick Douglass's home, of course, the big national parks like the Grand Canyon and what have you. So Nicodemus is a national park. It is called Nicodemus National Historic Site. That was designated in 1996, and we have been working with the Park Service over the last 20-some years to be brought up to speed and par, so to speak, as a national park. Because they don't own anything except for one building on the town site, it's very difficult for them to allocate monies to Nicodemus because they don't actually own buildings. They have a visitor center there, and we currently utilize our staff at the Nicodemus Historical Society to run the visitor center for them. That just is a contract, an agreement that we just got made in September of this past year. So it's been a long time coming, but now we are actively involved in the interpretation of our history there. So when you come to Nicodemus, you don't necessarily see people in green uniforms. You see people that are dressed similar to what I have on today, and these are descendants that know the history and being trained on history and can tell you the history as well as some of their family's stories and connections. So that's Nicodemus in a nutshell. And before I go into the pictures, are there any questions so far?
Why did they name it Nicodemus?
Nicodemus was named after a prophet. They say he was at least that wise. They said he talked about a better time coming, and that would be when slavery would be over and African Americans would be free. So there was a song that the slaves sung on a plantation about him, and a guy by the name of Henry Works put the lyrics and music to print right after emancipation, and it became a very popular song. And they also did a dance called the Nicodemus Jig, and so that's where they got the name from. In the lyrics it says, "Wake him up for the great jubilee," and so the chorus actually was changed to reflect the Solomon Valley where Nicodemus is located, but that's where the actual name came from. They say he was one of the first to purchase his freedom in the United States, and he came over on the second slave ship, the Treasure. So that's where the name comes from. Although there are the biblical similarities, you know, the promised lands of Kansas, the Solomon River, the Exodusters, all of that. So there are those parallels. Any other questions? I know you guys are just burning with questions. You're just embarrassed to ask, right? It's all right. You can ask them when I get finished here. What I did in 2012 was we do a newsletter quarterly, and for years, we were doing the newsletter, but I thought it would be great if we could showcase some of the historical photographs that we have in our collection, which is at the Spencer Research Library at KU. And so in 2012, the Nicodemus Historical Society published this a photographic book of the Children of the Promised Land. And what we did was we selected about 200 photographs out of about 500 photographs that we had of children from infants all the way up to teens, and we wanted to put them in a book so that people could actually see a part of the collection. We have thousands of historical photographs, which is amazing to me that we have as many photographs as we do. But when I say thousands, I'm not even exaggerating. Thousands of historical photographs And we add to that collection and have been adding to that collection more recent photographs and photographs that people are donating to our historical society. So this, can everybody see?
If you good lights up there, you might be better.
So these are just some of the photographs that we actually have highlighted in the book. I bought several copies of the book if anyone is interested in purchasing. They're $20. I also have some brochures on from the National Park Service and the Nicodemus Historical Society also. When I put this book photographic book together, I wanted to make sure that people got a real good glimpse of the children, the first generation and second generations being born into freedom. And as I was putting this all together, it occurred to me that I needed to have some type of commentary so people could understand the context of what we were really doing with these photographs. So I'd like to talk about the slave experience for children being born slaves versus once they're born free. You know, in slavery, if you were a child, let me just say this. There's really one word that kind of explains the difference between raising a child during slavery and a child being raised born free. And that one word is choice. The mothers, many of them, this is not the case across the board because nothing is ever really all black and white, but the mothers did not have a choice many times in terms of who the father was going to be. So many of the slave masters took advantage of the women, and a lot of the children that were born to these slave women were fathered by their masters. And typically, those children were raised in the house with the family, not necessarily taken on as family members, but raised as slaves in the house with their siblings, and they being the slaves for those children. I just recently finished a book by, her last name is Kidd. She wrote that book, Secret Life of Thieves, and she wrote a book, I can't even think of the title of it now, it's come to me, where she is talking about being raised with, as a white child being raised along with a slave that's the same age, who was a playmate, who was also her half-sibling. But she has literally given this little girl, the slave, on her 10th birthday. And she doesn't really want the child as a slave, and because she herself, as a little girl, can't understand the dynamics of that, and so she protests to her family. But if you were born and your master was your father, typically those children, not all of them, but typically those children were raised in the house as slaves of the other children that were of the masters. So many times the females did not have any control over the choice of who the father was going to be. And these children were brought up, if you were a child brought up in the slave quarters or working in the field, so to speak, or working, doing the hard slave work in the fields and what have you, it was quite different than the ones that were reared in the house. The ones that were reared in the house, although they were slaves, it appeared to the ones that were being raised in the quarters that they had it a little bit better. But in reality, they didn't. And that created a division in our culture. African Americans always are referring to house slaves versus field slaves, lights versus the dark. And so that created a dissension and division in our culture, and it stems from those children being reared in the house versus the ones that were reared in the field. This is just one of the promotional flyers for Nicodemus. Free land on free soils. That's different than slaves being born and reared in slave states. Who were they? These babies, these toddlers, these young children and teens, siblings, relatives, and friends, born and reared in Nicodemus. Who were they? Many of them were slaves that were house slaves, and many of them were born as field slaves, so to speak. What's really interesting are the real distinction between those two. Here's an example of the choice and how that makes a difference during slavery versus after slavery. A mother would not necessarily have a choice in naming her children. If you saw that movie Roots, and then the sequel to it was called Queen with Halle Berry in it, I don't know if you saw that, but in that movie it really depicts what I'm talking about. Her mother, she was born the daughter of the master, and the mother wanted to name her princess. And he decided when he put the name down in his slave log that he was going to name her queen. So, choice again. The mother did not necessarily have a choice in who the father would be of her children. She did not necessarily have an opportunity to name her children or even rear her children. This particular case, Queen's mother actually was not a house slave. She was a field slave. But when Queen was probably about 4 or 5 years old, she was taken from her mother and she was reared in the house as one of the slaves of the other children. And so she would only see her mother on occasion. So even though they were right there on the same plantation in the same area, she was relegated to being in the house as a house slave, and her mother was a field slave. So in the case where you have the opportunity to name your children, after slavery is over, you now have a choice in who you want your children, who you want your father of the children to be, as well as being able to name them. We have a story of a family member. All of her children were born in slavery, and they all had the last name of Worthington. And she was pregnant at the time of emancipation. So when she had the child after emancipation, she chose to name that child that was born free after her first slave name. So if you're doing genealogy as an African American, you can see the difficulty in tracing the families through just the names alone. You can get to slavery. If you can get to slavery, you're doing good. But then once you get to slavery, there's many instances where people change their names, and that's an example. Here's another example of how people would change their names. We had 2 brothers that were called Welton brothers. After emancipation, one kept the name Welton, the other one changed his to Wellington. If you don't know that from the family genealogy, you think that Welton and Wellington are 2 different families. So you can see how the genealogy becomes very, very difficult to really trace. And even though they have all this DNA stuff, and Henry Louis Gates talks about how you can find, your relatives and all, he makes it seem like it's easy. It's extremely difficult for most African Americans. Let alone when I was coming up in the 60s and the 70s, where it was all about being black and proud, and many people changed their names from their slave masters' names. Like my last name is Bates. If I chose to change my name, I could. Many changed their names to African names. So if you're doing genealogy and you're trying to find and trace people, if you hit these brick walls because you don't know when people changed their names or what they changed it to. So it's not as easy as it may seem to be. But again, it was the main word that kind of is indicative of the contrast between raising a child born free versus one in slavery is the word choice. The first baby born to Nicodemus. Now, the boy in the center, in the back, his name is Henry. He was born October the 30th, 1877. His mother and father are seated there, and his brother there on the left-hand side is my grandfather. So Henry was the first baby born to Nicodemus. The naming practices of slaves were such that you would try to keep track of your children by naming them after your siblings. I have a sister named Cheryl. If I had a child during slavery and I had an opportunity to name my child, I may name my child Cheryl also. That way, if they got sold away and she knew which plantation she came from, she could track her family genealogy, so to speak, back to this particular slave plantation. And that was the case also with boys. You would name your sons after your own brothers. If that wasn't the case, then you would name them after your master's siblings. And so in this case, my grandfather, who was younger than Henry was named after his uncle Henry. But my grandfather, Charlie, was named after Charles's father. So it's not always this thing of juniors and seniors and that kind of thing. It's some of the slave practices that kind of bled into naming and rearing children when they are free. So the children that were born free, let me just back up to Henry. Henry was the first baby born in Nicodemus right after they arrived. Within 30 days after they arrived, my great-grandmother had Henry. And just to read a little excerpt from the books that we have here, I just wanted to give people an idea of what it was really like for Emma to have him. In the fall of 1877, young and pregnant Emma Johnson Williams, Johnson was her maiden name, so to speak. She was born on Richard M. Johnson's plantation. Richard M. Johnson was the vice president under Van Buren, who lived in Georgetown, Kentucky, where many of the people came from. So her last name was Johnson, but when she got married, it changed to Williams. They traveled to an unknown land. With her siblings and parents, she journeyed to Nicodemus, Kansas, far beyond the horizon of what was familiar and known to her and her parents as former slaves on the plantation of Vice President Richard M. Johnson of Georgetown, Kentucky. Emma traveled without her husband, Charles, who promised to meet her at Nicodemus in the spring. To know her child would be born on free soil must have replaced any apprehension she felt facing the unknown. When she gave birth to the first child of Nicodemus, a child born to experience freedom, shouts of joy must have rung across the barren and windswept Kansas prairie. The angels of heaven must have sung a song of joy while the spirits of the ancestors celebrated with great jubilee. The birth of a strong boy during that harsh fall of 1877 was a sign of the strong will required to face the challenges and hardships ahead. As a new mother, a pioneer woman, Emma met those challenges and hardships with raw tenacity and a strong faith in God. She had survived childbirth and was proud to give birth to the firstborn child of Nicodemus. God himself must have been pleased when those first cries rang out, letting heaven and earth know this tiny baby was one of the first generations of African-American children born free, on the free soils of Kansas. This firstborn was named Henry after his uncle on that late October day when little Henry took his first breath. Burning buffalo chips used as fuel, dirt from the dugout where he was born, and his mother's warm skin were his first scents. Light that flickered from a nearby candle or lamp was the first light to his tiny eyes. Beyond the sounds of his loving voices, his ears must have heard the cry of the lone wolf, the sweet song of a Kansas meadowlark, the cooing of a dove, or perhaps the screech of a red-tailed hawk. Kansas welcomed him as he welcomed his first breath in his new world. And that is how it began in Nicodemus, October the 30th, 1877, on the free soils in the promised lands of Kansas. So you can imagine what it would have been like for the mothers that were coming to Nicodemus, like Eliza Taylor, who had children. Those children had been reared as former slaves, but her child, who was now about 11 years old, had been born free. So in her household, she had a child born free, and siblings of that little girl had been born as slaves. So you can imagine just the contrast in their psyche as children, being born free versus being born slave. I'll just go through here and just show you some of the photographs of the babes all the way up to the teens. It's amazing that these children were photographed. I'm just really surprised at the number of photographs that we actually have of the children of Nicodemus. Many of these photographs are studio photographs. They're fairly obvious. But then there are some that were actually taken by individuals who had cameras, which also surprises me when I think about how isolated Nicodemus was and how people then must have had some kind of means to buy these cameras, like this particular photograph. And raising these children for these mothers must have been really interesting, because if I'm a former slave and I don't really have an opportunity to rear my children, I have no control over them at all. If they decide that they want to sell this child at the end of the year because they need extra money, they can sell the child, or me. If they decide that they want to just buy new slaves and bring them in, they can do that. These children, these mothers had no control over their children. They had no control over their husbands. Matter of fact, it was really illegal for slaves to be married. They would allow them to cohabitate, and many of them were allowed to jump the broom and be married, so to speak. But it wasn't until after emancipation that slaves had to register their marriage in the courts, because they were not really legal until that actually happened. They had to go get remarried and file them in the court. And those slave records, those slave marriage records, become records to do research. You see a lot of people getting remarried. Some people didn't. If you wanted to take claim to your husband, and maybe he was one that you had just recently married because you were sold to a new plantation and that's who you cohabitated with, you had to, he had to basically agree that you were taking a claim to him, because the right was given to the first woman, if he could prove it, that had his children. So many of them had children by many different women, and they may have jumped the broom on this plantation but was sold down the road to another woman, and the woman that he was married to at the time of emancipation, so to speak, if he decided he wanted to be with her versus the one that he was formerly married to, then who was going to force him to stay with her? So it was a very interesting and peculiar situation after emancipation, not only with the children, but also with the husbands of these women that had these children. Obviously a studio photograph. That's not a studio photograph. It's taken right outside the barn. Believe it or not, that's my great uncle. Like a little girl. Obviously a studio photograph. To be able to raise your children for the first time and have total control over them must have been challenging also, because you've been raised a slave yourself, and your children are slaves. You don't have any control over them at all in terms of their play, their education, or anything like that. Now you are being given the opportunity. Yes?
Are there any narratives from the women of Nicodemus that speak about raising children or even family life after slavery?
We don't have any narratives necessarily, but over the years, in the last 30 years, there have been many, probably at least 5 oral history projects that have been done. And I don't believe there were any that were done of any of the former slaves. Yeah, I don't think there was done. It was the first generation afterwards that had been actually interviewed. I have to tell you about this little photograph. This is me right after we moved to California. So those are my siblings. My one brother that's on that side and the girl next to him are deceased. And my oldest brother, who's holding my little sister, he lives in Belgium. My little sister lives in the DC area, and my sister next to me, she lives in Los Angeles. And my dad died in May. He had just turned 90. He was about 90. He had been 90 just about, not quite 30 days when he died. That's us in Nicodemus. Quite a difference. City kids, country kids. City kids, country kids. This is my great-grandmother, Annie Bates, and her two daughters, my two great-aunts. This is my other, I'm sorry, this is another photograph of her with all four of her daughters. Some of the photographs are just absolutely phenomenal, like that one. I just think that's just neat. Two brothers in the teens. And by far, this is probably my favorite photograph out of all the children's photographs that we actually have. I just love the glasses and the hat. And that's a very tiny photograph. That photograph is less than an 1.5 inches square. It's really a tiny, but it's just crystal clear and reproduces very well. Yes, they even played Making Snowmen. That's my great uncle there. He went to school in Stockton, Kansas, which is where they had sundown laws. Here's the 1915 class of Fairview school kids. The lady that's seated there, her name is Lula Craig. Lula Craig died at about 102, and she lived out in Manzanola, near Manzanola, Colorado, right before she died. And Harry Belafonte threw her a birthday party, and they filmed the whole party and all. And it's a documentary that's called Happy Birthday, Lula Craig. She was an old pioneer woman, not only in Nicodemus, but also went out to the dry, as it was called, after the turn of the century. But she was a school teacher, and quite a phenomenal woman. She was in the process of writing a book, and her manuscript is at the University of Kansas, Spencer Research Library. Some of the stories that I can tell about some of the slave families and all come from her manuscript. But that's her teaching one of the schools in Nicodemus. Nicodemus had about 3 or 4 schools in the area. Nicodemus School District number 1, the first one in the county, is located right on the town site. It's one of the 5 historic buildings that make up Nicodemus National Historic Site. There's 2 churches, an AME church, a Baptist church, the St. Francis Hotel and Post Office. The post office that I said was run by Zach Fletcher. He was the first African-American postmaster in the United States to run a post office. And of course our Township Hall, which is a WPA project. Is that the end? I think that's me. It is. Basically, those are just a few of the roughly 200 photographs that we actually have in the book. And with each section, like the infants to the toddlers, I give a little bit of narrative to talk about what it was like for these women raising these children. And even just imagine what it was like for them to even talk to their teens about dating. You know, not being able to do that during slavery, but now they have an opportunity to rear their children. So what kind of values are they going to instill into their children? These are the challenges that were faced by all African American women that had endured slavery and that had moved to the West and started to rear their own children on the free soils of Kansas. So it was a very powerful thing that was happening to them as they were rearing these children, being faced with challenges that they had never, and opportunities that they had never had to deal with before. Just think in terms of your child, you don't have to worry about your child being sold away or being beaten. Those are the kinds of things that these African American women had to deal with psychologically. It must have been absolutely wonderful. Yes?
Do you think those psychological effects that African American women experienced during slavery, do you think that they might have carried over to Nicodemus and maybe in some ways carried over to their children?
Yes. And I think not only those things affecting the women, the children, the men, I think all of the psychological effects of slavery, it's like post-traumatic syndrome. And it's not just us, it's also whites. Because, oops, now the battery is gone. Sorry about that. Yes, I think there's a lot of things that get carried over culturally that we don't really talk about, we don't really deal with. But really there are many cultural differences in the way we rear our children versus the way that the white standard is. Typically in the African American culture, girls are reared to be very independent, and we are known for being very opinionated as well as independent, but that is as a result of slavery. We had no one to depend on. We could not depend on the man. Where in the white culture, it's like the man is the breadwinner, he's the head of the household, but in the African American culture coming out of slavery, there was no head of the household. The woman has just as much of a right to what's happening to her and her life and her children as he does. And many of the men, they had many families, many children, and they didn't have any control over themselves nor their children. So all of that plays out even today. So we say that we raise our daughters, but we love our sons. And that basically means that we raise our daughters to be independent and self-sufficient and not to be dependent upon men. And we love our sons. And that's all as a result of the slave experience. Yes?
What size of families were typical of Nicodemus at the time?
Large.
Large?
My mother is one of 13. It's the opposite with my dad. He was basically the only child, but he was born a twin. But most of the families had large families. And they ended up intermarrying with one another, the different families, which basically causes all of us to be related today.
So it would be very similar to the white population, essentially at the same time out there.
In terms of the, yes.
Yeah, it's
yes.
size family, because they were
yes,
too.
Typical. There was no birth control.
Yeah.
Most of their occupations agriculture, farming.
Yes. Many of them coming out of Kentucky were skilled laborers because tobacco was not king in Kentucky until after emancipation. So it was hemp. And so the people that were former slaves were on, they weren't even considered plantations because they weren't really large. And the average slave owner in Kentucky was about 5% of the population, and out of that 5%, the average number of slaves that they owned was 20. And so they owned small family units, and so there wasn't these huge plantations where, you know, you got hundreds of slaves and you have an overseer. That just wasn't the case in Kentucky. And Kentucky basically had laws that they instituted almost immediately after statehood, prohibiting bringing slaves into the state because there was a fear of an overpopulation of slaves. And although Lexington became the Athens of the South, as they were called, they had a corner on the market of mulatto and mixed blood women that they supplied the Louisiana market with. Louisiana men always wanted to have mistresses, and so the Lexington became the place where they would get a lot of these women from. And these women would bring the greatest amount of money. An average male may bring $1,200 to $1,500 if he was really a stud, so to speak. And if you were a mulatto or a mixed blood woman, typically they were very pretty women, and they would sell them to the Louisiana market for on average of $5,000. And they were kept women. And that gave rise also to, going back to that movie, which is the sequel to Roots, which is Queen. Queen basically is a mulatto woman, very pretty. She's shunned by the African Americans because she doesn't fit in with them, and she's shunned by her own white family that she's reared with, even though she's a slave. And so it leaves this void in these mixed bloods. And so as she goes to Louisiana, she takes up with another mulatto woman that is really passing for white. And when she ends up dating this guy, he eventually finds out that she's not white and beats her. But ultimately, she ends up going to one of these balls. They call them masked and unmasked balls, and that's where the men would select their mistresses. And these were women that were kept women. So, but that gave rise to a division in the culture also, because if you're light complected, you are told and shunned by the darker ones because they think you have it better and it's easier for you to acclimate into the white culture than if you're really dark. And that's not necessarily true. The hardships on both sides of the color spectrum are just as bad. But it does give rise to our own cultural bias towards one another because of the color of our skin. And we make fun of one another. We make names, and we call each other names like red bones. Red bone is someone that's light complected. Someone that is really dark, we may call them, like in my household, my mother used to beat us when we started making fun of one another, because my oldest brother is real dark, and so is my oldest sister. And myself and my other brother were probably the lightest ones in the family. And my mother would not tolerate us calling each other names. And but that's what you do as an African American kid. When I was growing up, you just called each other names. And there was a little saying that we said, which was, you know, if you're light, let me see how it goes. If you're black, get back. If you're brown, you can stick around. And if you're light, you're all right. That was just one of those sayings that we used to say. It's very culturally devastating to be on either side of the fence. You know, I was called names when I was young, and because I looked the way that I looked, a lot of people thought maybe I wasn't even black. But I was called names because of the texture of my hair and because of the lightness of my skin. I was made fun of, and then the same thing would happen with the darker kids. And we would call them Sambos and names like that, which aren't very, my mother would just beat us as she heard us make those nasty names, calling those nasty names to one another. Yes? You
mentioned that a cultural division occurred between house slaves and field slaves. Mm-hmm. Do you think that this colorism, or really the paper bag test, sort of that you're sort of discussing right now. Do you think it rises originally, not so much necessarily from skin color, but maybe from that distinction between house and field slaves?
Both.
Both.
Both. Because the ones that were in the house were typically the mixed bloods. And what she's referring to in terms of paper bag test, especially in Louisiana, they have these, I wouldn't call them secret societies because they're not really secret, but they have these colored societies that, and one of the things that they try to do is they try to marry white so they can get the African American blood out of them. So in order to belong to some of these societies, so to speak, if they use the paper bag as a test, if you're the color of the paper bag or lighter, you can join or be a part of it, and if you're darker, then you can't. They also call those blue vein societies also. Blue veins mean that if you were to look at the veins, like in my arm, they're blue, but if you're real dark, you can't see that. So I would pass to be able to belong to a blue vein society. I met a young lady from New Orleans years ago that came to Nicodemus and who was very, very fair-skinned and told me that she was the darkest one in her family and she was shunned because they were all passing for white. And she happened to be a little bit darker than they were, and she was really shunned. But those are the kinds of things that really go on in the African American culture as a result of all of that stemming from slavery. Yes.
Around Nicodemus, were there a lot of black homesteaders?
Yes. I think we probably have the largest land mass that was homesteaded by African Americans in the United States. The township is 6 miles by 6 miles, and pretty much all of that, I wouldn't say all of it, but I'd say at least 90% of it, when it was settled by blacks, homesteaded by blacks. And then they settled all the way to Hill City, which is about 13 miles west of Nicodemus. Homestead National Park, which is up in Beatrice, Nebraska, is working with the University of Nebraska on a project to identify African American homesteaders. And we have a map of all of those original homesteaders and where they actually homesteaded.
I think Bo still had a high school when I was in high school, late 60s. Did Nicodemus have a high school?
No, they went to Bogue. They went to Bogue. They closed the grade school that went to 8th grade in the early 60s, like 1962. They closed the school. And so they started, the kids started to go to school in Bogue.
Bogue used to have some really good athletes. And if you look through this book, you can see the names, Switzer, Alexander.
Yeah.
A lot of good athletes from Bogue High School.
Yeah, Burl Schweitzer, who graduated from there, played for the Green Bay Packers. He integrated the team. He's still alive today. Matter of fact, last weekend we had a program where we were highlighting the 6 NFL players from Nicodemus. Gale Sayers and his brother Ron, Gerald Wilhite, who played for the Denver Broncos, and his brother Kevin, and Burl, and his nephew Marvin, who played for the Buffalo Bills. So we had an exhibit and a program last week on the NFL football players.
How big is Bogue?
Right now, I think we've got maybe 140 people, 135 people in Bogue. It's not very big. And there's a post office and a bank there. That's about the only businesses that are there. Do you students have any questions? Anything at all? I'm sure you have.
There's a student over here that has a question.
And one over there.
She was wondering if the students that were attending Bogue, if they were taught by white instructors.
Yes. Yes. When they left Nicodemus, and Nicodemus always had African American teachers, but when they started going to school in Bogue and now Hill City, the instructors are white.
Were they treated with kindness or with equality when?
Well, I didn't grow up in Nicodemus and go to school there, but my cousins talk about all kinds of things. Many of them had friends that, you know, would take up for them, and there was always one or two kids that would call them names, and that would lead to fights and that kind of thing. I think it was very typical. We have a tendency to think that because Kansas was free that there was, you know, no Jim Crow, but it was Jim Crow here, and people did discriminate. I just say in the early years, prejudice and discrimination was balanced, so to speak, or tempered by the environment. The environment had played a major role in how people treated one another, especially if they were farmers. But yeah, they had, my uncles, they had white blood in them, and one uncle in particular had blue eyes, and he could pass for white. Now, his brothers, my grandfather was a little bit darker, and when they would go out and work together, they would think that Alvin was white, and many times they would say, well, you know, you can come in, but your friend can't. He said, well, that's my brother. And so they were discriminated against. They were discriminated against right there in Hill City. They could not, they would sit in the back rows in the theater. My dad told a story about when he was young. We had a cousin named Leroy Vanderval, and the Vanderval family were great, big, huge men. I mean, they were like almost 7 feet, all of them. And Leroy went into the theater, and he said he was not going to sit back in the back anymore. And nobody dared to tell him to move because he was such a big guy. But yeah, they faced discrimination. How about you? Do you have any questions? Anything at all that kind of crosses your mind or intrigues you or makes you want to think about it differently? How about you with the glasses?
Me?
No.
No. Okay.
No.
Can't tell right where you're looking.
Yes. And I say, you know, a lot of people will say, you know, they're not prejudiced, and sometimes you don't even know that you are. And just because you were not brought up around African Americans and you didn't have an opportunity to discriminate, segregation alone is enough to foster prejudice and discrimination, whether you know it or not. It's like I wake up every morning and I know I'm African American. I look in the mirror and I decide what I'm going to do today. If I wash my hair, am I going to wear it in a fro or am I going to wear it straight? You know, there's always the decisions that we face day in and day out in terms of how we're going to be and how we're going to act and what we're going to say. There's, it's called wearing the mask. And in order to acclimate and deal with the white culture, we acclimate to the white culture, we talk and try to fit in. But if you go to the African American community or you go to the home at night, if you have an opportunity to be one that gets a chance to sit and listen, it's so totally different than the way we interact with whites out in the world, because we're amongst ourselves and we are loud, we're very opinionated, we can tell someone off and nobody gets upset. You know, nobody's going to hold any grudges because we speak our minds. If I don't like the dress you have on, I may just say, girl, why are you wearing that dress? You ain't looking right in that thing. We don't get upset if we someone gives something that starts at 9 and nobody shows up until 10 or 11 or 12. Nobody gets upset. But so the way we deal with time and the way that we deal with one another in terms of how we feel about one another, we say what we have to say without getting really bent out of shape about it. So there are some cultural differences, and people that are married into black families, they get a chance to see what that's like on the inside. And I think one of the psychological scars of slavery, so to speak, that has been fostered in whites is the fear of large groups of blacks getting together. What are they doing? You know, what are they doing over there? And then if we get loud, it's like, oh, someone's getting ready to fight. We just express ourselves very animately at times. But I think that's a fear that's fostered because of the slave experience. in the Jim Crow laws. African Americans cannot gather together in large groups because there may be an uprising, you know, they may take over or whatever. So I always say, if you can find a good black friend, it's good to have one. You get a little bit of insight into the real African American culture. I said I was going to start a service that, you know, you want to hire yourself out to black friends. But there are some things that culturally, even as females, we see things a little bit differently. You know, African American women, again, we rear our children, the women especially, the girls especially, to be independent. And one of the things that my mother always said to my sisters and I was, you always have to have your own stash. What does that mean? You have to have your own stash. Well, you never know. You never know when you may be on your own. And then the sisterhood. You know, it's one of those things now that's become very vogue to use the word sister, S-I-S-T-A. Really, as African American women, we kind of resent that because the sisterhood has always been the African American women that were the aunts and the grandmothers and the mothers that would take care of all of the children. You know, so the sisterhood is something that we pride ourselves in, because if you have a friend that has a daughter, or you know someone that's going to have a child, you know, we rally around those women. And so the sisterhood really came out of the slave experience. They were the infirm women, the older women, the aunts, the grandmothers that took care of the children. And so we refer to the sisterhood about to one another. You know, our sisters. We will refer to another female as a sister. But it's become very vogue. Yes, ma'am.
What in your opinion, what is one of the biggest struggles that African American women have in today's society?
Being on the bottom of the totem pole. I would say that and this is a conversation that many of us African American women are having today amongst ourselves, and that is that there are no men for us. And when I say that, it's literally true. Statistically, if you're over the age of 45 and you're single, chances are you'll be single the rest of your life, because there aren't any men for us. And African American men, especially during my generation, many of them were killed in Vietnam. And typically, and I say typically because it's not written in stone, African American women typically do not like white men. And it's because of that whole slave experience. But the dialogue now is amongst the sisters is that you got to get over it. If you find someone that is white that's interested in you, then you go ahead and cross that color barrier. But because of the sexual abuse that was taking place with African American women during slavery, it just developed in us this disdain for white men. And so typically, when I say typically, because this is not true across the board, I know many women that, I don't know many, but I know some African American women that are married to white men. But black men find black women very hard to get along with, because we are so independent and so opinionated. I mean, and if you're a successful black woman, it's even harder, because you're considered, excuse my language, but you're considered a bitch, because you think you know it all, and if you have a better financial situation than them, they just shun you. So for African American women, I think our biggest struggle is just literally not being taken seriously as women. You know, we don't, typically in a world, and in this culture in particular, where, and this is not true across the board, that women are supposed to be a little bit more subservient than in their relationship with men. Women have a role and men have a role. African American women take on the masculine role many times because we have no choice. So that I think I think that's the hardest thing for us as African American women, and to be accepted as women with our strengths. Yes.
I'm interested in that idea that it's been how many generations since slavery, and yet this resentment of white men. Do you have any observations on what the mechanism is that can persist through generations?
I think it's a reality that kind of perpetuates it. And what I mean by that is you can see black men with white women, but what's the ratio compared to black women with white men? So I don't think that, I think the reality is that it's there, we see it, and then I think that amongst ourselves, and in certain families more so than others, there's the talk, you know, about it. And if there's family members that, for example, I mean, here's a common situation. If you're really, really liked, obviously there's white blood in your family. And it probably did not come down from a white relative that's a female. It probably came down from a white male.
So just the logic of it is in.
Yeah, it's just there. I have a friend that is half white, and she looks like she's white. She could pass for white. Her hair is straight. She looks like she doesn't even look like she has an ounce of black in her, but she's totally black. Culturally, she's black. She was raised with black people. She is black. She resents the fact that she looks the way that she does. And a lot of women that are mixed bloods, especially in my generation and back, many of them resent that in them. So it's talked about. You know, it gets perpetuated with us talking about each other's hair. You know, if your hair is straight and long, you obviously have some white blood in you somewhere. And so we know that, so there's that, again, that prejudice against one another because of the hair and the color of the skin. So that sets up that whole dynamic of not wanting to be associated with white men. So we ourselves perpetuated, you know, that division. And many of us in the dialogue in the African American women's community right now is that, you know, they're writing about it in our magazines now. We're bringing it out to the open and discussing it. And all you have to do is pick up the Essence magazine. There's at least 1 or 2 articles, or 3 or 4 during the year where they're talking about that in particular, and how African American women are getting over the stigma of being with white men.
I don't think these conversations are happening among whites. I'm not sure though.
Well, I don't know.
I don't know.
You know, I have several cousins, this is an interesting dynamic in Nicodemus. Most of my cousins that grew up in Nicodemus, male and female are married to whites. And it's because who else were they going to date? And that's all they could acclimate to was the people that were around them. And they're in a unique situation because they're in a rural environment. Then they go to the city, and they have a hard time relating to some of the blacks because they grew up in an environment that was pretty much, you know, all black, but they're all related. So the challenge is to how do you date someone that's black? So most of my cousins my age that grew up in Nicodemus are married to whites, female as well as male. But it's an interesting dynamic.
It's complicated.
It is. I don't have any problem with white men. I grew up in Pasadena, California, where, you know, it was the whole era of peace and love and all that kind of stuff, and flower children and what have you. So there was a lot of interracial relationships in the environment where I was. But the very first time I went to Kentucky, it just blew my mind, the number of the division between whites and blacks. And in the South, you see that more so than you do in the West, or even here in the Midwest. I mean, some things are just taboo where slavery took place, and it's hard for those people, black as well as white, to get out of the psyche of that, being in that environment. the things that has surprised me over the years by talking this dialogue with whites is I learned that we, as African Americans, have prejudices against whites that are really unfounded. You know, we have a tendency, and I know I've done this many times myself, look out and see people that I think are a particular way, and just to find out they're just the opposite. And that whites really do want to understand why we are the way that we are. There is this thing about not wanting to offend us. Wouldn't you say that's true, that you guys don't want to offend us? I found that to be one of the most mind-boggling things. I was like, what? That you don't know. What should we call you? Colored? African-American? Afro-American? African-American? Black? You know? And we know, generationally, we can almost tell a lot about your understanding of blacks by what you do call us. Like my parents, they did not want to be called black. They did not want to be called African American or Afro American. They wanted to be called Negro or colored. But Negro or colored for our generation it dates us. It makes us feel like, okay, we're talking to someone that really has a limited knowledge of blacks. But it's just that whole fear of we don't know what to say. We don't know if we don't want to insult you. And I had to learn that. It surprised me.
There's a project at, I think, Harvard called Implicit, about implicit bias. Have you heard of that?
No.
It's pretty interesting. You can take a fairly sophisticated online test by pushing a couple of keys, responding quickly to pictures and things, gender, race, and sexuality and sexual preference. It's interesting to take those tests. I'm kind of fascinated to explore that because it's almost impossible not to have some kind of bias.
Yeah, we do, whether we want to. I mean, we as African Americans, I know many racist blacks as I do some that I've met that are white. And I'm quick to point that out to my fellow black friends and relatives. I say, you're a racist. Oh, no, I'm not. They think that, many of them think that you're a racist only if you're white, and you don't like white people, and you don't like black people. But there's many blacks that don't like whites and are racist. And I know there are many, because I've met them and I know them, and some of them I'm related to. And I am the one that will be quick to tell them, that's a racist attitude. You say that whites are racist, you're being just as racist.
So do you have a definite way to define the distinction between just an implicit bias versus racism?
They're so close.
Well, they sure seem like, I'm sure from the perspective of the recipient of behavior, but implicit bias where you just aren't aware of it, so you behave in a certain way.
It's like if you live in an environment and you live on a street where 2 doors down there's someone that's black, and you go play with the kids, and your parents come out, and then they say, don't go down to Johnny's anymore, and you really don't know why. You can't go down to Johnny's anymore. They don't really explain it to you. It's just that you can't play with them. Well, you're being taught, and you very subtly you find out, well, why? What's the difference here? Kids are not born prejudiced. That prejudice is being taught.
I think you're right.
It's being taught. But I think that in this country, the biggest problem that we have with race is we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. I mean, we just don't. Whites are afraid, and blacks will be quick to get angry. Well, that just makes me mad. I don't want to talk about it. Well, why not? How many days of slavery have you spent? I always think that we have to start there and look at slavery and all of its effect, just like the things I'm talking about tonight. We need to talk about those things and put them out there. For example, the whole dynamic of a white woman in a house with her husband's slave children. I mean, think about that. As a woman, Would you want to be in a house with your husband's slave children, even though they may be slaves? And many times these women were living in houses with men that slept with their slave mistresses, and they never slept with their wife. Think about the dissension that created between white women and African American women. If you've seen that movie, 12 Years a Slave, that's a dynamic movie. And you know the scene where the slaves are being woke up in the middle of the night to entertain the master, and he wants to see his favorite slave mistress dance. And his wife is so angry, the only way she can take her anger out is to take it out on her. I mean, so she's being abused, and she can't help it. She's being abused in all kinds of ways. And the only retaliation that the white female has is to use her power to inflict pain or whatever. Oh, I'll sell her away. I know that's, his favorite slave. She really belongs to me because it was a slave that I got when I was a kid, so I'm going to sell her away. So I don't have to deal with her. Then you got these kids running around in the house that are your husband's kids. The dynamic of that household is absolutely horrific. But we never talk about those psychological effects because they still play out even today. They just do. They're there very subtly. But we need, I always say, how many of you in here own any slaves? Raise your hand. Nobody can. Now, some of these women may feel like they're slaves to their husbands, but nobody can say they really own any slaves unless you're in trafficking or something like that. And if there were African Americans in here, I would say, how many of you raise your hand if you spent one day in chattel slavery? So you haven't experienced slavery. We may both be dealing with the psychological effects of it, but I have no reason at all to blame you for owning slaves. And it's stupid to assume that everybody that was white owned slaves. I found out that in Kentucky only 5% of the whites did. And that everybody that was black during that time period was slaves. And that they were all house slaves. And that they were all beat. We have stories where my great-great-great grandmother and grandfather, the ones that led the group from Leavenworth, their family was split during slavery because her master died. He was a prince. That's interesting, isn't it? He was a prince, and when he died, his wife Lavinia decided, I'm going to move to Weston, Missouri. I'm going to take my slaves with me. Well, that meant she was going to go, and her husband, who she jumped over the broom with and was allowed to cohabitate on the weekends, was going to be left in Kentucky. And so his master, who was a prince, it was his uncle that owned his wife, he said, I'll do everything in my power to get you guys back together. I'll find somebody that I can sell you to. And he did. He didn't have to, but he did. And that's in my great cousin Lula Craig's document. She says John Samuels was sold to a man in Weston, Missouri, right down the road from where his wife was. And the family ultimately got back together. But that was because his master did that. Yeah, he was still a slave, but he didn't have to do that. So everything was not absolutely horrific. The institution itself was, but it varied from geographic area to geographic area. In Kentucky, you didn't have large plantations. In Mississippi and the coast, they had huge plantations where they had 200 or 300 slaves and they never saw their master, not even on Christmas. They had overseers. And so the dynamics of a slave growing up on a plantation like that versus a place where the master owns just, 5 or 6 or maybe 20 slaves, and maybe they're just a family unit, that dynamic is totally different. So slavery differed from one area to the next, from one plantation or household to the next. And I'll tell you something interesting about Vice President Richard M. Johnson. If you don't believe what I'm going to tell you, look it up online. He was married 3 times to his slaves. He never married a white. And Van Buren said, you will never run on the ticket with me again. He married his slave, Julia Chin, had 2 daughters, and publicly educated, and didn't care what anybody thought about it. And his one daughter, Imogene, ended up being the master of my great-great-great-grandfather, John Samuels, who led that 3rd group, and Richard M. Johnson owned my great-great-grandfather, Tom Johnson. So, you know, he was a man that was unconventional at the time, and he didn't make any bones about it. And his daughter, Imogene, married a man by the name of Daniel Pence. I wonder if Pence, Vice President Pence, is related to any of those Pences from Georgetown, Kentucky. It'd be interesting if he found out he's got some black in his blood. I say that facetiously, but I really mean it. It would be interesting to find out, you know, that name Pence is just not a very, very common name. It's common in Indiana and in Kentucky.
Well, there's a lot of surprises out there in the gene pool, I'm sure.
Yeah, it is. But anyway, any more questions? I'm glad I had the opportunity to talk to you guys, and I appreciate the opportunity. Like I said, I just I get a kick out of talking about Nicodemus and various aspects of the history of Nicodemus. So it pleases me to be invited in to speak, and I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be sure to take a couple of the brochures, and if anyone's interested in any of the books, they're $20 for the Historical Society.
If you're a student, go ahead and sign the paper, let them know you were here.